The courtroom hummed with a tension so thick it pressed against the chest like a hand. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters, city officials, crime-beat journalists who had covered wars and scandals, all of them leaning forward, all of them waiting. Cameras rolled behind the glass partition at the back. Sketch artists' pencils hovered, frozen mid-stroke. This was not just a trial. This was the trial. A racketeering and murder case so high-profile, so politically charged, that the mayor had issued a public statement before the first gavel fell. And at the center of it all sat Pyong Kayubong, the man the tabloids called the Dragon of the East Side, his neck tattoos coiling like smoke above the collar of his orange inmate jumpsuit, his jaw set, his eyes lifted toward some invisible point above the judge's bench, unreadable, unmoved. A man accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room, now stripped of everything except his silence. The prosecution's case was, on paper, airtight, except for one thing. There was no forensic trail, no weapon, no confession. Only one living witness to the night Marcus Watkins disappeared, and that witness had not spoken a single word in 4 months. Her name was Annie Watkins. She was 8 years old. Welcome. If you're watching right now, I need you to help me prove something. My colleagues at work told me I'd never reach 1,000 subscribers, that stories like this one are too heavy, too real, too complicated for people to care about. I disagree. I believe people like Annie deserve to be heard. If you believe that too, hit subscribe before this story is over, and let's prove them wrong together. No one expected what happened when the courtroom doors opened. The bailiff announced the witness. The stenographer straightened. Public defender Anthonia Mully, a tall woman in a charcoal blazer, carrying the weight of too many underfunded cases behind her eyes, turned in her seat, her expression professionally neutral, her hands folded on the table with deliberate calm. Annie walked in alone. She wore a pale blue dress, her braids neat against her shoulders, her small hands clasped in front of her like a child heading to Sunday school rather than the most watched trial in the city's history. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at the rows of suits and strangers who had come to watch her break, or fail, or disappear into her silence the way everyone expected her to. She looked at him. She walked directly toward the defense table. Anthonia Mully's breath caught in her throat. The prosecution team exchanged glances. A murmur rolled through the gallery like the first rumble before a storm. The judge raised her hand to call for order, but stopped, because Annie had reached the table, and without hesitation, without flinching, she pulled out the empty chair beside Pyong Kayubong and sat down. The man who had allegedly ordered the deaths of 6 people did not move. He did not look at her. His tattooed hands remained flat on the table. Then Annie placed her small hand over his. The courtroom went absolutely still. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. She leaned up toward him. Her lips moved. Whatever she said lasted no more than 4 seconds. A whisper so quiet it didn't reach the microphone, didn't reach Anthonia, didn't reach the judge or the jury or the 50-odd reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. It only reached him. And for the first time since his arrest, Pyong Kayubong's expression changed. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger. It was something far more unsettling, something that looked impossibly like relief. His eyes dropped to Annie's face. His jaw shifted. And then, very slowly, the man the city had spent 4 months calling a monster turned to look directly at the state prosecutor's table. Not at the lawyer. At the man sitting behind the lawyer. The man with the golden pin on his lapel. Anthonia Mully saw it. She grabbed her legal pad and wrote 4 words, underlining them twice. He knows who did it. What Annie had whispered in those 4 seconds didn't just contradict the prosecution's case. It didn't just create reasonable doubt. It cracked open something underneath the entire trial. A secret buried so deep, protected by people so powerful, that a little girl who hadn't spoken in 4 months was the only one left alive who carried it. This is the story of how Annie Watkins found her voice, and how the truth she carried brought down something much bigger than a mafia boss in an orange jumpsuit. If you believe that children deserve to be protected and that the truth should matter more than power, hit subscribe. Comment "Justice for Annie" below and stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. They had come for him at 4:47 in the morning. Not because that was when the evidence was strongest. Not because the warrant had just cleared. They came at 4:47 because that was the hour when even the most dangerous men were soft with sleep, when the body was heaviest and the mind was slowest, when a legend could be reduced to a man blinking against flashlight beams in his own bedroom. 14 armed officers. 2 armored vehicles parked at the mouth of the alley behind the Hanok-style restaurant on Linden Street that served as both the finest Korean barbecue in the city and, according to the indictment, the operational headquarters of the most sophisticated criminal network the East Side had seen in 30 years. Pyong Kyu-bong did not run. People who knew him said later that this was the detail that unsettled them most. Not the arrest itself, not the charges. The fact that he simply stood in his kitchen in a white undershirt and bare feet, looked at the men pointing rifles at him, and said, in perfectly measured English, "Let me put on my shoes." The footage leaked within the hour. By 6 a.m., it was everywhere. The city had been waiting for this moment for a long time, or at least, it believed it had. For nearly a decade, the name Pyong Kyu-bong had moved through the East Side like weather. You didn't always see it coming, but you felt it when it arrived. He had built his operation quietly, methodically, in the spaces the city had already abandoned, the blocks where the streetlights had been dark for years, the storefronts that changed names every 6 months, the port warehouses where the longshoremen looked the other way because looking the other way paid better than anything the union could offer. He was not, by the accounts of people who had actually dealt with him, a theatrical man. There were no gold chains, no entourage, no performative cruelty designed to reinforce a reputation. The reputation reinforced itself. The tattoos climbing his neck told their own story to anyone who could read them, and plenty of people in this city could. What the city knew, or thought it knew, was a greatest hits compilation assembled by years of tabloid coverage and police press conferences. 6 unsolved murders in the Eastport district, all within territories where Kyu-bong's network operated. A protection racket that allegedly stretched across 43 businesses in 3 zip codes. A suspected hand in the disappearance of a DEA informant named Marcus Watkins, a man with a daughter and a secret life and a body that was never found. The district attorney had stood at a podium the morning after the arrest, looking like a man who had just won something enormous, and used the word, "finally," 4 times in a 6-minute statement. The city exhaled. Editorials were written. A pastor on the East Side gave a sermon about the fall of Goliath. The restaurant on Linden Street was photographed so many times that the owner of the dry cleaner next door complained he couldn't get customers through the door for all the media vans blocking the sidewalk. Except the people who actually lived on those blocks, the ones who had bought groceries at the store Kyu-bong allegedly taxed, whose kids went to school 2 streets from the warehouse the indictment described, they were quieter about it. Not because they mourned him, but because they understood something the editorials didn't. The problems that had made space for a man like Pyong Kyu-bong did not get arrested with him. The dark streetlights were still dark. The union wages were still insufficient. The city's appetite for celebrating his arrest was not matched by any visible appetite for addressing what had made his rise possible in the first place. But that was not a conversation anyone in power wanted to have right now. Right now, the story was simple and the story was clean. The dragon was in chains. The months between the arrest and the trial were their own kind of theater. The prosecution filed motion after motion, building a wall of paperwork around a case that was, if you looked at it from the inside, significantly less solid than it appeared from the outside. The forensic evidence was circumstantial at best. 3 of the original witnesses had recanted by September, citing procedural concerns that the defense team was not slow to amplify. The DEA informant file on Marcus Watkins had been partially sealed under a national security provision that the prosecution invoked and refused to explain. Anthonia Mully, appointed as public defender when Kyu-bong refused the private attorneys his network could certainly have afforded, had filed 11 motions challenging the evidentiary chain of custody, before the first pre-trial hearing even concluded. She was thorough, underpaid, and deeply skeptical of the ease with which this case had been assembled. She had told her paralegal, 3 weeks before the trial began, that something about the architecture of the prosecution's case felt less like investigation and more like construction. Like someone had decided on the conclusion first and worked backward. Her paralegal had told her she sounded paranoid. She had told him she preferred careful. What neither of them knew yet, what no one in the courtroom had fully understood when Annie Watkins walked through those double doors in her blue dress, was that the man in the orange jumpsuit was not the architect of Marcus Watkins' death. He was its most convenient explanation. There is a difference between a man who is dangerous and a man who is guilty. And in this city, in this case, those two categories had been quietly, deliberately, catastrophically merged by someone with enough power to make it stick. Pyong Kayubong knew this. He had known it since the night the warrant was served, since the moment he laced up his shoes and walked out into the cold with his hands behind his back. He had stayed silent through months of hearings, through the media coverage, through the DA's press conferences and the editorials demanding justice. He had said almost nothing to Anthonia Mully beyond the bare minimum required, and she had found his silence infuriating and professionally fascinating in equal measure. He was waiting, for what she couldn't determine. And then Annie walked in. 8 years old, in a blue dress, with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on his face. The daughter of the man whose death was being used to put him away forever. She should have been terrified of him. Every instinct, every narrative the city had constructed around his name, every story the prosecution had spent months telling, all of it said she should have sat as far from him as the room allowed, should have trembled, should have needed coaxing just to remain in the same space. Instead, she sat beside him. She put her hand over his. She leaned in close. And she said 4 words that told him she knew. Not suspected, not feared. Knew, in the way that children know things because they were present for them and no one thought to account for them, because adults consistently underestimate how much a quiet child in a doorway sees and stores and carries. What she whispered, Anthonia Mully would not learn until later. What she saw in that moment was the expression on Kayubong's face shift like tectonic plates, slow, massive, irreversible, and the way his eyes moved immediately to the state prosecutor's table, not to the lawyer, to the man behind the lawyer. She had looked then, instinctively, toward the same point. The man with the golden pin sat with his legs crossed and his hands loose in his lap, the posture of someone absolutely certain they are not the subject of scrutiny. He was senior enough to be present, anonymous enough to be unremarkable. He had a face designed, it seemed, for being forgotten. He was watching the judge. He was not watching Annie. He did not notice Anthonia noticing him. She wrote 4 words on her legal pad, pressed her pen down hard enough to score the paper beneath, and made a decision that would consume the next 14 days of her life and threaten considerably more than her career. The dragon was in chains. That much was true. But the city had been looking at the wrong monster all along. If you believe that every person, regardless of who the world has decided they are, deserves a fair process and the presumption of truth, hit subscribe and comment, I stand for justice below. The people who won't comment, they already know why. She had not spoken since the night of October 14th. Not to her mother, who had held her through the first week of silence with the particular desperation of a woman trying to love a child back into language. Not to the school counselor, who had tried art therapy and music therapy, and simply sitting in the same room saying nothing, hopping the quiet would feel safe enough for Annie to fill it. Not to the child psychologist the court appointed in November, a kind man with reading glasses and a soft voice who had written in his final assessment that Annie Watkins presented with selective mutism, consistent with acute traumatic onset, and that her ability to provide coherent testimony was, in his professional opinion, unlikely. He had used the word unlikely twice. The prosecution had cited his report in 3 separate motions. What nobody cited, because nobody had thought to ask, was what Annie did every morning before school. She sat at the kitchen table with a box of 64 crayons and she drew. Not the chaotic scribbling of a grieving child working through feelings she couldn't name. Deliberate drawings. Detailed ones. The same scenes, refined and revisited, growing more precise with each iteration as though she were trying to get something exactly right. Her mother, Denise, had collected them in a manila envelope without fully understanding why. Something about the specificity of them made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't articulate. There was always a girl under a table. There was always a big figure nearby. And there was always, in the background, rendered in careful black crayon, a shape that looked almost like a pin. Denise had given the envelope to Anthonia Mully 3 weeks before the trial. Anthonia had stared at the drawings for a long time and then placed them in a folder marked, simply, "Do not file yet." The morning Annie was scheduled to testify, the courthouse steps were crowded before 7. Not with supporters. There was no organized vigil, no signs, no chanting. Just people who had read the coverage and wanted to be near whatever was about to happen. A news anchor did a live segment from the bottom of the steps, describing the day's proceedings with the reverent gravity reserved for historical events. The graphic behind her read, "Silent witness. Will she speak?" Inside, the atmosphere was different, tighter. The kind of tension that lives not in noise, but in the absence of it. The careful movements, the lowered voices, the way every person in that room seemed acutely aware of the weight of the day pressing down from the ceiling. The skepticism was not subtle. It moved through the courtroom in glances and postures. The jury consultant for the prosecution had recommended, privately, that they not rely on Annie at all, that putting a mute 8-year-old on the stand was a liability, that the defense would dismantle her credibility before she produced a single usable word, if she produced any words at all. The lead prosecutor had overruled him. He needed the optics. He needed the jury to see her face and feel what her presence was supposed to make them feel, even if she said nothing. The story of Annie Watkins, the daughter left behind, the silent ghost of the man Kayubong allegedly ordered killed, was doing more work for the prosecution than any forensic exhibit in the case. That calculus was cynical, and he knew it, and he had made it anyway. Anthonia had known it too. She had prepared for it, building her cross-examination around the exploitation of a grieving child as a prosecutorial prop, ready to name it plainly if she had to. She sat at the defense table that morning feeling the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been fighting uphill for so long she had forgotten what level ground felt like. Then the doors opened, and Annie came in. She was smaller than the room expected. That sounds like a strange thing to say about a child, but courtrooms do something to scale. The high ceilings, the dark wood, the formal geometry of it all makes everything inside feel like it should be proportionally significant. Annie, in her pale blue dress with her braids sitting neat against her shoulders and her hands clasped at her waist, looked like something the room might accidentally swallow. A court officer near the door shifted instinctively, some protective reflex he couldn't have explained. She paused just inside the entrance. Her eyes moved across the room slowly, methodically, in a way that didn't read as fear so much as inventory. She was cataloging the space, the faces, the exits, the furniture. She had the eyes of someone who had learned to assess a room quickly, who had learned. In the way children learn things, they should never have had to, that knowing where everything was mattered. The jury watched her. The gallery watched her. The stenographer watched her with her fingers resting motionless on the keys. Then Annie's gaze found the defense table, found him, and whatever calculation she had been running behind those careful eyes reached its conclusion, because she moved, not toward the witness stand, not toward the prosecutor who was already rising with a practiced, gentle smile, but straight toward Pyong Kayubong. The skepticism in the room didn't disappear, but it shifted shape. It became something closer to bewilderment, which is what skepticism becomes when the thing it doubted does something it cannot immediately explain. Nobody in that courtroom had predicted this. The psychologist's report said unlikely. The prosecutor's consultant said liability. The news graphic said WILL she speak. Annie Watkins sat down beside the man the city called a monster, placed her small hand over his tattooed one, and answered all of them at once. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. The courtroom had absorbed a great many surprising things in its long institutional life. Confessions delivered with unsettling calm, evidence that unraveled years of assumption, verdicts that split a room clean down the middle. But there was something about the image of Annie Watkins sitting beside Pyong Kayubong, her small dark hand resting over his tattooed one, that bypassed the analytical mind entirely and landed somewhere older and deeper. It didn't make sense. And because it didn't make sense, the room's collective instinct was to go very, very still, the way you go still when you're not yet sure if what you're seeing is a mistake or a revelation. Anthonia Mully was the first person to recover. Not visibly. Outwardly she remained exactly as she had been, hands folded, expression measured. But internally she was moving fast, recalibrating, pulling up everything she knew about Annie and everything she suspected about this case and running it through a new filter. She watched Annie's lips move. She watched Kayubong's face change. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from months of preparation colliding with one unexpected moment, that whatever Annie had just said was not nothing. It was not the nervous murmur of a traumatized child seeking comfort from the nearest adult. It was deliberate. It was specific. Annie had walked across that courtroom with a destination in mind. The lead prosecutor, a man named Gerald Fitch, was on his feet before Annie finished whispering. His chair scraped back loud enough to punctuate the silence like a gunshot. He didn't object. There was nothing technically to object to. Not yet. The witness hadn't been sworn in. The examination hadn't begun. But he needed to move, needed to reassert some control over a room that was slipping sideways from the script he had spent months writing. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the particular strain of a man working hard to sound untroubled. "Perhaps we should proceed with swearing in the witness at the stand." The judge, a woman named Honorable Claire Pinnock, looked at Annie for a long moment before she responded. She had presided over difficult cases before. She had managed volatile defendants and unreliable witnesses and attorneys who confused aggression with competence. But she had a quality that the better lawyers in this city recognized and quietly respected. She watched. She noticed things. And what she noticed right now was that Annie Watkins, having finished her whisper, had not flinched or retreated. She sat with a stillness that was not the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of someone who had just set something down after carrying it for a very long time. "Ms. Watkins," Judge Pinnock said, her voice measured and gentle, "would you come to the witness stand, please?" Annie looked at the judge. Then she looked at Kayubong. Something passed between them. Not words, not gesture, just the brief acknowledgement of two people who now shared the same dangerous knowledge. And then Annie stood, smoothed the front of her blue dress with both hands, and walked to the witness stand. She was sworn in. She sat. Her legs didn't reach the floor, and she sat with them hanging, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady. The prosecutor approached. Gerald Fitch was a skilled courtroom presence, tall, measured, with the kind of patrician confidence that juries in this city had historically found reassuring. He smiled at Annie in the way adults smile at children when they need something from them. Careful, calibrated. "Annie," he began softly, "can you tell the court what you remember about the night of October 14th? Silence. Fitch nodded slowly, as though this was expected, as though he had prepared for it. "Take your time. There's no rush." More silence. The stenographer's fingers hovered. Then Annie turned her head, not toward Fitch, not toward the jury. She turned and looked directly at Anthonia Mully, the public defender she had met exactly twice before today, a woman she had no particular reason to trust except that trust, for Annie, appeared to operate on a frequency other people couldn't hear. Anthonia kept her face still and gave the smallest possible nod, almost imperceptible. "It's okay." Annie turned back to face the room. "My daddy knew him," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear. It had the texture of something unused, slightly rough at the edges, but it carried. Every person in the room heard it. Fitch blinked. "I'm sorry, Annie, can you tell us who you mean by?" "Mr. Bong." She said the name without hesitation, without the fear the prosecution's entire case assumed she would feel. "My daddy knew him. They used to talk, on the phone. Daddy said he was helping keep us safe." The murmur that moved through the gallery was low and immediate. Fitch's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. At the prosecution table, His second chair leaned forward and wrote something on a legal pad, underlining it with hard, fast strokes. "Annie," Fitch said, recalibrating with visible effort, "do you remember the man who came to your house that night? The night your father—" "It wasn't Mr. Bong," Annie said. Simple, flat, certain, not the uncertainty of a child guessing, not the coached cadence of rehearsed testimony. It was the voice of someone reporting a fact as obvious to them as weather. The silence that followed was a different quality than the silences before it. This one had weight. It pressed against the walls. Antonia wrote 3 words on her legal pad, slowly, deliberately. "The case breaks." Gerald Fitch stood in the center of the courtroom with a 4-month-old narrative collapsing quietly beneath his feet, and the man behind the prosecution table, the man with the golden pin on his lapel, shifted in his seat for the first time all morning. Annie watched him do it, and said nothing more, for now. If you can't stand watching powerful people use their position to crush those who can't fight back, comment "Everyone deserves respect" below. Subscribe and stay with us. Because what Annie knew and what she was willing to say next was about to change everything. The recess was called at 11:23 a.m. Judge Pinnock had read the room correctly, the way a good judge always does, and understood that what had just happened required more than a moment to absorb. 15 minutes, she said. Her voice carried the particular authority of someone who knew 15 minutes would not be enough but was offering it anyway, because the alternative was watching the proceedings unspool entirely in open court. The gavel came down, and the room exhaled in pieces, people turning to each other with the urgent, low-voiced energy of witnesses, trying to confirm they had all seen the same thing. Antonia was on her feet before the echo of the gavel faded. She had exactly 15 minutes and she needed all of them. She crossed to where Bong sat between 2 court officers, her legal pad under her arm, her pen already uncapped. She had asked him things before, during the pretrial hearings, during the 3 formal consultations she had managed to secure in the months leading up to today, and he had given her the minimum each time. Polite, cooperative on the surface. But sealed in the way that certain people are sealed, not from hostility, but from a long-practiced assessment that the less said, the safer the terrain. Today was different. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his eyes had moved since Annie's words landed. Something had shifted in his calculus. She sat down beside him and placed her legal pad flat on the table. "She said it wasn't you," Antonia said quietly, not a question. Bong looked at her for a moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I need you to help me understand what that means," she said, "and I need you to start now. Because in 13 minutes that judge comes back, and Gerald Fitch is going to spend the rest of this afternoon trying to rebury what Annie just dug up." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Look at my arm." She had seen the tattoos before, of course. They were documented in the prosecution's exhibits, photographs taken during the booking process, clinical and color-corrected, submitted as evidence of gang affiliation. The standard prosecutorial move. Here is a man whose body is a confession. But she had looked at them the way the prosecution wanted her to look at them, which was as decoration, as identity signaling, as the visual grammar of a criminal life. She looked now with different eyes. His left forearm was the most densely worked, a full sleeve that climbed from his wrist to disappear beneath the orange jumpsuit at his elbow. Traditional Korean patterns woven through more figurative imagery. A dragon, naturally, rendered with the kind of detail that spoke of hours under a needle, and an artist who knew exactly what they were doing. But threading through the scales of the dragon, worked into the negative space between the traditional motifs, were what she had previously registered as abstract fill patterns. Lines and dots and small geometric shapes that gave the piece its texture. She leaned in closer. They weren't abstract. "These are numbers," she said, almost to herself. "Dates," Bong said quietly. "Amounts, initials." He turned his arm slightly so the light caught the inner surface. "This one," he indicated a section near his wrist where the dragon's tail curled into an intricate knot, "is July 2019, 47,000, RC." Anthonia's pen was moving before he finished the sentence. RC, she repeated. Regional Commissioner, he said. Infrastructure and Development. She stared at him. You tattooed a financial ledger onto your body. I tattooed insurance onto my body, he said, with a flatness that told her this was a distinction he had considered carefully and lived by for years. In my business, paper burns, phones get seized, hard drives disappear. But they could not take my skin without killing me first, and if they were going to kill me, they needed to do it before I got to a courtroom. He paused. They tried other ways first. The implication of that sentence settled over her like cold water. She looked back at the tattoos with the focus of someone who had just been handed the key to a lock they'd been working for months. The dragon's body was a timeline. The flowers worked into his right shoulder contained a separate thread. Different transactions, different initials, different years. She could see it now that she knew how to look. The whole piece was a masterwork of hidden architecture, an entire ledger disguised as art by an artist who was presumably compensated generously enough to ask no questions. How many entries? She asked. 41, he said, across 6 years. And Marcus Watkins was helping me document the most recent ones, Kayubong said. His voice didn't change when he said the name. That steadiness cost him something, she could tell, but he kept it. He came to me 14 months ago. He said he was DEA, said he'd been building a case against the syndicate for 2 years and couldn't crack the financial layer. I had the financial layer. He glanced down at his arm. All of it. So he was your informant, Antonia said slowly, and you were his source. We were each other's, Kayubong said, which made both of us dangerous to the same people. She let that sit for exactly as long as she could afford to let it sit, then kept moving. The night he disappeared. I was in Busan, he said. I have the entry stamps. I have hotel records. My attorneys, the ones before you, gathered them in September and filed them in a motion that was denied on procedural grounds, so narrow I needed a microscope to read the ruling. There was no bitterness in his voice when he said it. Just the steady, factual recitation of someone who had watched the machinery work against them and taken careful note of every gear. Antonia looked at her legal pad. She had filled 2 pages without realizing it. Who filed the motion to deny? Kayubong looked at her. The state prosecutor's office, he said. Specifically, the senior advisor to the prosecution, the man who has been sitting behind Gerald Fitch's table since day 1 of these proceedings. He paused. The man with the golden pin. The court officer near the door shifted his weight. Across the room, the double doors were already opening. The 15 minutes had elapsed. The gallery was filing back in, the machinery of the trial reasserting itself with its awful, indifferent momentum. Antonia had one more question, and no time left for it, so she asked it anyway. Why didn't you say any of this before? Why wait? Kayubong was quiet for a moment. He looked toward the doors, toward the gallery filling back in with its suits and its cameras and its appetite for a verdict it had already decided upon. Because saying it required proof, he said, and the proof was on my skin, and I needed someone in this room to actually look. He glanced at her. And I needed to know Annie was safe before I let anyone know she had something to say, because the moment they understood what she knew, she became a problem that needed solving. Antonia thought about the child psychologist's report, the 3 recanted witnesses, the sealed DEA file, the motion denied on procedural grounds so narrow you needed a microscope. She thought about Gerald Fitch's face when Annie said it wasn't Mr. Bong, the way it hadn't registered shock so much as damage assessment. She thought about the man with the golden pin, who had shifted in his seat for the first time all morning at precisely the moment Annie went silent. She stood up, straightened her blazer, and clicked her pen closed. In the 14 hours that followed, through the afternoon session, through the recess, through the long night she spent in her office with a forensic documents expert she trusted, and a photographer who could render Kayubong's tattoos in high enough resolution to make the hidden text legible, the shape of the real case began to emerge from behind the false, one like a building behind scaffolding. 41 entries. 6 years. Initials that corresponded, with a consistency that made her stomach drop. to names she recognized from City Hall letterheads and charity gala programs, and the masthead of the Civic Foundation that had, 3 years ago, given the state prosecutor's senior advisor its annual Integrity Award. The dragon had not been keeping a record of his crimes. He had been keeping a record of theirs. And he had been waiting, with a patience that had cost him everything, for someone willing to read it. Anthonia Mully had not slept. This was not unusual for her during a trial. Sleep had always been the first casualty of a case that mattered. But the particular quality of this sleeplessness was different from the ordinary exhaustion of preparation. She had lain on the narrow couch in her office at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling with the specific alertness of someone whose mind refuses to stop turning a thing over, examining it from every angle, because every angle keeps revealing something new. The photographs of Caillou Bong's tattoos were spread across her desk in high-resolution prints, annotated in red pen, cross-referenced against a timeline she had constructed on the whiteboard that took up most of her east wall. The forensic documents expert had left at midnight. The photographer had left at 1. Anthonia had stayed because there was nowhere else to be, and because the manila envelope Denise Watkins had given her 3 weeks ago was sitting on the corner of her desk. And every time she thought she was done with it, something pulled her back. She opened it again at 3:47 a.m. There were 23 drawings in the envelope. She had reviewed them before, had noted their consistency, their detail, the recurring motifs that Denise had found unsettling without being able to articulate why. But she had looked at them then as supplementary material, as the emotional record of a traumatized child, rather than as evidence in any technical sense. Now she spread them across the available surface of her desk in chronological order, the earliest ones first, and looked at them the way she had learned, in the last 14 hours, to look at things that were hiding what they knew in plain sight. The earliest drawings were the roughest. October, the dates in the corners suggested. Annie had been dating them without being asked, which told Anthonia something about the child's instinct for documentation that she filed away carefully. In the October drawings, the figures were simple. A girl under a table, rendered in the universal shorthand of childhood, oval body, stick limbs, a cloud of black crayon for braided hair. A large figure nearby, featureless, its size communicating threat more effectively than any detail could. And behind the large figure, smaller, almost incidental, the shape Denise had described as looking like a pin. By November, the drawings had grown more specific. The girl under the table remained consistent. Same position, same crayon cloud of hair, same small hands pressed flat against the floor in a gesture that made Anthonia's chest tighten every time she looked at it. But the large figure had acquired details. A jacket, rendered in careful blue-gray. Trousers with a center crease that an 8-year-old had no business knowing how to draw but had drawn anyway, over and over, getting the lines straighter with each iteration. And the background figure, the one Denise had noticed and not been able to name, had grown more defined as well. It was set further back in each drawing, positioned with a consistency that spoke of memory rather than imagination. Always to the right, always slightly elevated, always rendered with that same small bright mark at the lapel. A golden pin. The large figure in the foreground, Anthonia had initially assumed, was Caillou Bong. The prosecution had certainly assumed it. It was the obvious reading, the big threatening presence in a child's trauma drawings, the looming figure that filled the frame and dominated the space. But she looked now at the jacket, the careful trousers, the absence of any neck markings, the shoes that Annie had drawn with a buckle on the side in December's version that she had refined in January's until the buckle was precise and specific. These were not the drawings of a man in an orange jumpsuit. These were the drawings of a man in a suit. She sat with that understanding for a long moment, the office silent around her, the city outside beginning its slow gray approach toward dawn. Then she picked up the December drawing, the one with the most detail, the one Annie had clearly spent the most time on, and held it under her desk lamp. The large, suited figure occupied the center of the frame as always, but Annie had done something in this version she hadn't done in the earlier ones. She had drawn a line from the large figure's hand, just a single crayon line, light enough that Anthonia had missed it in her first 3 reviews, extending backward, connecting to the smaller figure in the corner. A line of connection, of instruction, of command. The large figure was not the one in charge. The large figure was following orders from the man with the golden pin. Antonia placed the drawing down carefully and pressed both hands flat on her desk and breathed. She introduced the drawings on the second day of testimony, and she did it with the precision of someone who had been planning the sequence since 4 a.m. She requested permission to approach the bench first, spreading 3 of the drawings before Judge Pinnock with the chronological annotation she had prepared overnight. Gerald Fitch objected on relevance grounds. Antonia argued that the drawings constituted contemporaneous documentation by the sole eyewitness, created unprompted and undated by anyone other than the witness herself. Judge Pinnock looked at the drawings for a long time, longer than a relevance ruling required, and then admitted them into evidence over Fitch's objection with a terseness that suggested she had seen something in them that required no further argument. The drawings were projected onto the courtroom screen one at a time. The gallery's response was not dramatic. It was quieter than that, which was worse. It was the sound of a room full of people revising what they thought they knew, the soft interior sound of assumption giving way. Because even without Anthonia's annotation, even without the cross-reference to Kayubong's tattoo ledger that she had not yet introduced, the drawings were clear in the way that children's art is sometimes devastatingly clear. Unfiltered by the social instinct to soften or obscure, uncomplicated by the adult habit of considering consequence before committing image to paper. The large figure in the suit was not Kayubong. Any person in that courtroom who looked honestly at the careful buckled shoes, the pressed trousers, the absence of the neck tattoos that Annie had certainly seen, and would certainly have drawn if they had belonged to the figure she was depicting, any honest person could see it. The prosecution had built its case on the assumption that Annie's trauma drawings were a child's representation of the man who had terrified her. They were. But the man who had terrified her was not the man in the orange jumpsuit. Fitch's cross-examination of the drawings was aggressive and technically competent and visibly ineffective. He pressed on the subjective nature of crayon renderings. He questioned whether a child of Annie's age could reliably encode visual memory in representational art. He noted, with the careful neutrality of someone who knew exactly how it sounded, that the drawings had been in the possession of the defense team for 3 weeks before being introduced. Antonia let him finish, then she asked to reapproach. She introduced the 23rd drawing last, the January one, the most refined one, the one where Annie had added, in the very bottom corner, something she had not included in any of the previous 22, a detail so small that it was easy to miss, which was perhaps why Annie had kept it back, had built toward it across months of drawings before finally committing it to paper. In the bottom corner of the January drawing, Annie had written 2 letters. Not the large figure's initials, not Kayubong's. The letters were positioned directly beneath the small background figure with the golden pin, connected by the same light crayon line that linked him to the large figure in the foreground. The letters were RV. Antonia did not look at the prosecution table when she held the drawing up. She didn't need to. She could hear the quality of the silence from that direction, could feel the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure that meant something had just landed that could not be unlanded. She had cross-referenced the initials at 5 a.m. It had taken her 11 minutes. RV appeared twice in Kayubong's tattoo ledger, once in the entries on his right shoulder, once near the dragon's jaw on his left forearm, adjacent to the largest single transaction in the entire coded record. RV was not a minor entry in the ledger of the city's corruption. RV was where the money came from. And RV, as the court would come to understand in the days ahead, had been sitting in this courtroom since opening arguments, watching the machinery he had constructed process an innocent man toward a verdict that would bury his own crimes for another decade. Annie had drawn him from memory at the age of 8 with a 64-count crayon box and the uncluttered certainty of a child who knew exactly what she had seen. She had been waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it too. If you are exhausted by a system that shields the powerful and sacrifices everyone else, hit the like button right now. Only those protecting the shadows will keep scrolling. The rest of us stand with Annie. The tape almost didn't exist. This was the thing that kept returning to Antonia in the days that followed, the thing that sat at the back of her mind like a splinter she couldn't quite reach, how close it had all come to disappearing. Not because anyone had destroyed it deliberately, though she would later learn that attempts had been made, but because of the ordinary, mundane vulnerability of bureaucratic process, the way important things get lost not through malice alone, but through the compounding negligence of a system that was never truly designed to protect the people it claimed to serve. Dr. Victoria Brooks had been Annie's court-appointed therapist since November. She was a small, precise woman in her early 50s who had spent 23 years working with traumatized children and had developed, over those decades, a clinical patience that was almost architectural in its solidity. She did not push. She did not prompt. She created conditions and waited, with the confidence of someone who understood that the mind, given sufficient safety, would eventually move toward its own unburdening. She had seen it happen enough times to trust the process, even when the process was slow, even when the caseworkers and the attorneys and the court administrators were circling impatiently, needing something they could use. She recorded every session. Standard practice, consented to by Denise Watkins in the intake paperwork, documented in the case file. 41 sessions between November and February, each one recorded on the clinic's digital system and backed up to an external drive that Dr. Brooks kept in the locked drawer of her office desk because she had learned, years ago, that institutional systems were less reliable than they appeared. The backup was why the tape survived. Because in the third week of January, the clinic's digital system experienced what the IT department described as a partial server failure affecting files from the preceding 90 days. 40 sessions lost. Recoverable, possibly, with forensic data retrieval, but not quickly and not cheaply, and not without a formal request that had to move through 3 administrative layers before anyone with authority would approve the expenditure. Dr. Brooks had filed the request on January 24th. It was still pending when the trial began. But Session 41 was fine. Session 41 was 3 days old and lived on the backup drive in the locked drawer and had not touched the compromised server. Session 41 was from February 11th, 11 days before the trial's opening arguments. Antonia had listened to it for the first time at 6 a.m. on the second day of the trial, sitting alone in her car in the courthouse parking garage with her phone pressed against her ear and the recording playing through her earpiece. She had listened to it twice without moving. Then she had sat for a long moment with her hands on the steering wheel and the engine off, and the parking garage's fluorescent hum filling the silence around her. Then she had called Dr. Brooks. The foundation for introducing the recording required half a morning of procedural architecture that Antonia built with the methodical patience of someone who knew that what was inside the structure was worth every minute spent constructing it. She established Dr. Brooks's credentials, her methodology, the consent documentation, the recording protocol. She walked the court through the chain of custody for the backup drive with a specificity that made Fitch's associate counsel visibly restless. They objected 4 times, on grounds ranging from hearsay to relevance to the reliability of the recording medium itself. Judge Pinnock sustained one objection, a minor one about foundational sequencing that Antonia corrected without breaking stride, and overruled the rest with a brevity that suggested her patience for delay was thinning. The recording was admitted into evidence at 11:06 a.m. The courtroom was very quiet when it began to play. Dr. Brooks's voice came through first, measured and warm, the professional gentleness of someone who had spent decades learning how to make space feel safe. "Annie, you mentioned last time that you wanted to tell me about the shapes in your drawing. The one with the man at the back. Do you still want to do that?" A pause, longer than was comfortable. The kind of pause that made people in the gallery shift in their seats. Then Annie's voice. It was different from the voice she had used on the witness stand. Less guarded, softer, the voice of a child speaking in a room where she felt, For the first time in months, something approaching safe. But the clarity was the same. The precision was the same. He was tall, Annie said, but not the tallest one. The tallest one was in the front, but the tall one in the front was listening to him. You could tell because of how he stood. Like when I stand next to my teacher and I wait for her to tell me what to do, like that. Dr. Brooks's voice, gentle. And what did the man in the back look like, Annie? Another pause. He had a suit, Annie said, a dark one, and his shoes were shiny. I remember his shoes because I was under the table and I could see his feet. They had a buckle on the side. Silver buckle, a brief silence. And he had something on his jacket, like a little star but not a star, shaped different. It was gold. The courtroom was so still that the recording's ambient background noise, the faint hiss of a therapy room's white noise machine, the distant sound of a building's ventilation system, was audible to everyone. Can you tell me what he did, Annie? The man with the gold pin. The pause this time was the longest yet. Antonia, standing at the evidence table, did not look at the jury. She looked at her legal pad and kept her expression professionally neutral and felt her heart doing something complicated in her chest. He talked on the phone, Annie said finally. Before, he was talking on the phone when they came in. And then he said she stopped. The recording captured the sound of a child gathering herself, the small, effortful breath of someone picking up something heavy. He said, "Make sure there's nothing left." That's what he said. "Make sure there's nothing left." And the tall man in the front nodded. Like my teacher. Like when you're listening to someone who's in charge of you. And your father, Dr. Brooks began carefully. Daddy was already, Annie stopped again, a longer silence. Daddy already wasn't moving, she said quietly. He was on the floor. And the man with the gold pin looked at him and then he looked at his phone and then he left. He didn't run. He just walked out, like it was nothing at all. The recording continued for another 4 minutes. Dr. Brooks guiding Annie gently away from the memory, the practiced deceleration of a therapist managing a disclosure. But the room had stopped in those words. Like it was nothing at all. 8 years old, under a table, watching a man in shiny buckled shoes treat her father's murder as an item on a to-do list. When Antonia stopped the playback, the silence in the courtroom had a different texture than any silence that had preceded it. It was not the silence of uncertainty or procedural suspension. It was the silence of a room that had just had something confirmed that it had begun to suspect, and the confirmation was worse than the suspicion. She turned to the jury. She didn't need to say anything. The recording had done its work with a completeness that rhetoric would only dilute, but she had one more piece to place before she rested, and she placed it quietly. She introduced the shoe photograph. It had come from the court's own security archive, standard footage from the building's internal cameras, the kind of documentation that existed for liability purposes and was rarely reviewed by anyone. A single frame, enhanced and printed at high resolution, showing the hallway outside the courtroom on the first morning of trial. In the foreground, a man in a dark suit walking away from the camera. His face was not visible. But his shoes were clear, polished, formal, with a silver buckle on the side that caught the fluorescent light of the courthouse hallway with a small, bright precision. The same buckle Annie had drawn 17 times across 5 months of crayon documentation. The same buckle she had described in a therapy room 11 days before the trial began. Antonia placed the photograph on the evidence table and stepped back. She did not look at the man with the golden pin. She didn't need to. Across the room, she could see Kayubong's hands, flat on the table, perfectly still. And for the first time since she had taken this case, there was something in his posture that was not the careful composure of a man managing his own containment. It was something that looked, quietly and unmistakably, like the beginning of relief. Annie had spoken into a therapy room in February, trusting that someone was listening. Someone had been. If you're not siding with the liars, subscribe right now and comment "Truth over power." Because the people who stay silent while the powerful crush the innocent, they're not neutral. They're just choosing a side they won't admit to. The third day began like a held breath. There was a different quality to the gallery that morning. The reporters who had been cycling in and out across the preceding days had all returned, and returned early. The way journalists return when they sense that the story they have been covering is about to become a different and larger story entirely. The seats filled before 8. The sketch artists had fresh paper. 2 television correspondents who had not been present since opening arguments were back in the rear rows, their expressions carrying the carefully neutral alertness of people trying not to appear as though they already knew something significant was coming. Word travels in courthouses the way it travels nowhere else, through clerks and bailiffs, and the attorneys who share elevator rides, and the court reporters who hear everything and say nothing until they say everything. By the time Judge Pinnock took her seat and called the room to order, there was a collective understanding, unspoken and unverifiable, that today was not a continuation of the preceding days. Today was the thing the preceding days had been building toward. Antonia had arrived at 6. She had spent an hour sitting in the empty courtroom before anyone else was admitted, her materials organized, her notes reviewed for the last time. The sequence of what she was about to do mapped and remapped in her mind until it was less a plan than a physical certainty, something she could feel in her hands the way a surgeon feels a procedure they have performed enough times to trust the muscle memory. She was not calm exactly. Calm was the wrong word for the state she occupied in the hours before a moment she had been working toward for months. She was present. Completely, precisely present, every faculty oriented toward what was coming. She had spoken to Annie that morning in the witness preparation room, the small beige anteroom where witnesses waited before being called. Annie had been sitting in the chair nearest the door in her blue dress, the same one, carefully washed and pressed by Denise, who understood without being told that the dress had become something more than clothing, with her hands folded and her eyes steady. Denise sat beside her with the particular stillness of a mother who has run out of words, and found that presence is the only remaining currency. Antonia had knelt down, so she was level with Annie's face. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," she said. "Whatever happens in there today, you have already done something extraordinary. Do you understand that?" Annie had looked at her for a moment. Then she said quietly, "He was wearing the same pin today. I saw him in the hallway. He doesn't think I remember him." Antonia had held Annie's gaze for 3 seconds. Then she stood, smoothed the front of her blazer, and said, "I'll see you inside." She recalled Annie to the stand at 9:14 a.m. The room's attention was absolute, not the restless, contingent attention of an audience managing its own boredom, but the fixed, unblinking attention of people who have stopped thinking about themselves entirely and are simply watching. Annie walked to the witness stand the same way she had walked to the defense table on the first day, without hesitation, without performance, with the measured deliberateness of a child who had decided something and was seeing the decision through. She sat, her legs hung, her hands folded in her lap. Antonia approached slowly, giving the room time to settle completely, giving Annie time to locate herself in the space. She had learned, across the preceding days, how Annie oriented, the slight pause before speaking, the internal gathering that preceded each disclosure, the way her eyes moved to a fixed point when she was accessing memory rather than performing testimony. She had learned to read the difference and to wait for the former. "Annie," she began, "you've told us about a man you saw the night your father died, the man with the golden pin. You've described his shoes, you've described his voice, you've told us what he said." She paused. "Is that man in this courtroom today?" The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Antonia had counted these silences across 3 days of testimony, and she knew now that Annie's silences were not the silences of uncertainty. They were the silences of precision, a child making absolutely sure before she committed, because she understood, in whatever instinctive way children understand the weight of adult situations, that this particular commitment could not be walked back. Annie unfolded her hands. She placed them flat on the edge of the witness stand, and then she raised her right arm and pointed. Not at Gerald Fitch, not at the defense table, not at the rows of gallery observers whose collective intake of breath was already beginning. She pointed to the man sitting behind the prosecution's table, the man whose name Antonia now knew from 6 years of coded tattoo entries and a sealed DEA file, and the financial records that the forensic accountant had spent 40 hours reconstructing from the shell company payments, whose name was Raymond Voss, senior advisor to the state prosecutor's office, 12-year veteran of the city's legal infrastructure, recipient of the Civic Foundation's Integrity Award. The man with the golden pin, sitting in his dark suit with his silver-buckled shoes and the absolute composure of someone who has never, in 12 years, had a reason to believe the room would ever turn in his direction. Him, Annie said. He's the one who said make sure there's nothing left. He's the one who walked away. The room detonated. It was not a single sound, but a cascade. The gallery erupting in overlapping voices, 2 reporters already on their phones before the gavel fell, a juror in the second row with her hand pressed over her mouth, Fitch on his feet shouting an objection that was lost entirely in the ambient roar. Judge Pinnock brought the gavel down 4 times before the noise receded enough for her voice to carry. Order. I will have order in this courtroom, or I will clear the gallery entirely. The room descended, unevenly back toward silence. Raymond Voss had not moved. This was the thing that people would remark on afterward, in the articles, in the depositions, in the accounts that circulated through the courthouse for years. He had not stood up, had not protested, had not performed the indignation of an innocent man wrongly accused. He sat with his hands loose in his lap, and his face arranged in an expression of careful neutrality, and he looked for a long moment at Annie Watkins. And Annie looked back. She did not look away. She did not tremble or retreat into the silence that had protected her for 4 months. She sat in the witness chair with her small hands flat on the edge of the stand, and she held Raymond Voss's gaze with a steadiness that was, in its way, the most devastating thing the courtroom had witnessed across 3 days of devastating things. Because she was 8 years old and she had been under a table, and she had carried this for 4 months in crayon drawings and therapy sessions, and a silence so complete that the experts had doubted she would ever speak. And she was not afraid of him. Not anymore. What happened next unfolded in Anthonia's peripheral vision because she was watching Annie and could not stop watching Annie, but she registered it. Pyong Kyubong in his orange jumpsuit had turned in his chair. He had positioned himself slightly forward, his broad shoulders angled between Annie and the prosecution table, between Annie and Voss. It was not a dramatic gesture. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He simply moved his body into the space between a child and the man who had destroyed her family, and stayed there. The dragon in chains, becoming, in the most unscripted moment of a trial built on false narratives, exactly what the city had refused to believe he could be. Anthonia let the moment exist for exactly as long as it needed to exist. Then she turned to Judge Pinnock and said, in a voice that was steady enough to belie the 4 months of work and sleeplessness and fury that had produced this moment, Your Honor, the defense moves for an immediate recess and respectfully requests that the court consider the security implications of the identification just made. Judge Pinnock looked at Raymond Voss. She looked at Annie. She looked at Anthonia. She brought the gavel down once, cleanly. This court is in recess, she said. And bailiff, a pause, brief and weighted as a held breath, please ensure that Mr. Voss remains available to the court. Raymond Voss's hands, loose in his lap for the entirety of 3 days of testimony, finally moved. He pressed them flat against his thighs. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible. Annie saw it, and for the first time in 4 months, the corner of her mouth moved upward. Not a full smile, something quieter than that. The expression of someone who has put down something very heavy and can finally, for the first time, feel the absence of the weight. If you believe the truth should come to light no matter how high it reaches or how many people it inconveniences, subscribe and share this right now. Only those who fear the light will scroll past without hitting that button. The recess lasted 22 hours. Not the standard 15 minutes of procedural breathing room, not even the overnight adjournment that complex trials occasionally required. 22 hours, during which the courthouse became a different kind of institution entirely, less a place of deliberate legal process and more a pressure vessel, sealed from the outside by the weight of what had just happened inside it, humming with the particular energy of a situation that has passed the point where ordinary procedure is sufficient. Judge Pinnock had not gone home. This was the detail that the clerks and bailiffs would talk about afterward, the small human fact that crystallized the gravity of the preceding hours. She had ordered dinner from the Thai place 3 blocks east, eaten it at her desk, and spent the night reviewing case materials and making phone calls that she would not discuss in open court, but whose effects would become apparent within 12 hours. She had been on the bench for 19 years. She had presided over cases that had tested her faith in the machinery she served. But she had never, in 19 years, had a situation in which a senior officer of the court, a man with a Civic Integrity Award on his office wall, had been identified by an 8-year-old eyewitness in open session while sitting 20 feet from the judge's bench. She had also never had a case in which the evidence pointing toward that identification had been accumulating, hidden in plain sight, for 6 years on the skin of the defendant. She signed the emergency preservation order at 11:47. It covered Raymond Voss's office, his city-issued devices, the financial records of 3 entities whose names had appeared in cross-referenced form across Kayubong's tattoo ledger and the forensic accountant's reconstruction, and the sealed portions of the DEA file on Marcus Watkins that had been withheld under the national security provision. A provision the federal liaison had confirmed in a phone call that evening, that Voss's office had requested, and that the DEA itself had never actually sought. The warrant was executed at 2:14 a.m. Anthonia learned about the raid from her paralegal, who learned about it from a court clerk, who had heard the building's overnight security staff discussing the convoy of vehicles that had pulled into the municipal complex's underground parking structure in the small hours. She was still at her desk. She had not expected to sleep. She received the message, read it twice, set her phone face down on the desk, and sat for a moment with her eyes closed and her hands flat on her knees. Not in relief, not yet, because relief required a certainty she hadn't earned yet, but in something that felt like the first loosening of a tension she had been carrying so long she had forgotten what her shoulders felt like without it. Then she picked up the photographs of Kayubong's tattoos and looked at them one more time. 41 entries, 6 years, the dragon's body as a financial archive, the flowers as a secondary ledger, the geometric fill patterns as a timeline that 2 forensic accountants and a criminal finance specialist had spent 3 days rendering into a document that was now, as of 2:14 a.m., being used as a map by federal investigators moving through a government office in the middle of the night. The shell companies had been the key that unlocked the door, and the shell companies had been hiding in the tattoos in the simplest possible way, not in the initials, not in the transaction amounts, but in the dates. Each entry included not just the date of the transaction, but a secondary date, subtly encoded in the spacing of the surrounding linework, that corresponded to the incorporation filing dates of the entities receiving the payments. The forensic accountant had found the first one by accident, cross-referencing a transaction date against public incorporation records while looking for something else entirely. The second one he had found in 20 minutes. After that, the pattern was clear enough that he had worked through the night with the focused velocity of a man who understands that he is looking at something historic. 3 shell companies, 12 years of payments. Recipients whose names, when the corporate veils were finally stripped back by investigators with the authority and the warrant to do the stripping, included a deputy commissioner, 2 city council members, the director of a regional infrastructure authority, and Raymond Voss, who had not merely accepted payments from the network he had spent years ostensibly prosecuting, but had, according to the financial architecture the investigators were now mapping in real time, been among its primary architects. He had not been protecting the syndicate from prosecution. He had been the syndicate's insurance policy inside the prosecution. The legal infrastructure of the city, the machinery designed to dismantle exactly this kind of corruption, had been partially staffed and directed by the corruption itself. Marcus Watkins had found this out. He had brought the evidence to Kayubong because Kayubong was the only person in the city with both the motive and the means to preserve it in a form that couldn't be seized or destroyed. And Kayubong had done exactly that, had carried the record on his body, had waited with the patience of a man who understood that the right moment and the right witness were the only currency that would ever be sufficient. He had not anticipated that the right witness would be 8 years old. But then Raymond Voss hadn't anticipated it either. And that asymmetry, the vast, humbling asymmetry between the power of a senior government official and the memory of a child under a table, was what had made the whole architecture collapse. By 6 in the morning, the first details were beginning to appear online. Not from official sources. The official sources were still processing, still managing, still deciding how to frame a story that had very few flattering frames available. But from the courthouse adjacents, the legal bloggers and court watchers and retired attorneys who monitored these situations with the avidity of people who had spent their careers inside the machinery and knew exactly what a 22-hour recess following an in-court identification of a senior prosecutor's office staffer actually signified. By 8, the national outlets had picked it up. By 9, when Judge Pinnock reconvened the court, the steps outside the courthouse were crowded in a way they had not been even on the trial's opening day. The dynamic was different, though. The crowd that had gathered for opening arguments had the expectant energy of an audience. The crowd outside this morning had something else, something less comfortable, more unsettled, the gathering of people trying to locate themselves in relation to a story whose implications were still expanding. Inside, the room was quieter than it had been at any point in the preceding 3 days. The specific quiet of aftermath. Gerald Fitch was present but reduced, seated at the prosecution table with the careful stillness of a man trying to determine the precise dimensions of the situation he now occupied. Not implicated, as far as anyone had established, but comprehensively wrong, which in a courtroom carries its own particular weight. The associate counsel beside him was studying her own hands. Raymond Voss's chair was empty. Judge Pinnock surveyed the room with the expression of someone who has made peace with an extraordinarily difficult 22 hours and arrived at clarity. She spoke for 11 minutes. She outlined, in measured and precise language, the preservation orders that had been executed overnight and the federal coordination that was now underway. She addressed the jury with the careful instruction of someone navigating unprecedented procedural territory without a map, acknowledging that the trial's trajectory had shifted in ways that required formal reconsideration of the charges as currently framed. She made no dramatic declarations. She did not perform the gravity of the moment, because the moment was already performing itself. Then she said that the court had received, at 7:43 that morning, a federal filing that materially altered the evidentiary landscape of the case against Pyong Kyu-bong. The filing included, among other things, a DEA internal memo from 14 months ago documenting Kyu-bong's role as a confidential source. It included the travel records that Anthonia's original motions had tried and failed to introduce, the Busan Hotel, the entry stamps, the time-stamped documentation of a man who was not in the city on the night Marcus Watkins died. And it included the preliminary findings from the overnight examination of Raymond Voss's office, which had produced, among other material, a series of encrypted communications that the federal team's technical unit had partially decoded by morning, and which contained, in their recovered form, instructions specific enough in their language to make the word orchestrated not a legal argument, but a factual description. In the 4th row of the gallery, Denise Watkins sat with her hands pressed together and her eyes fixed on a point above the judge's bench. She had not slept. She had not eaten since the previous morning. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn yesterday. Beside her, the seat that Annie had occupied for 3 days of testimony was empty. Annie was in the witness preparation room with a court-appointed family advocate, away from the cameras, away from the gallery, in a small beige room where the weight of what she had done could settle around her at a pace she could manage. Denise heard the judge's words. She heard the phrase materially altered. She heard the word orchestrated. And she did something she had not done, not once, across 4 months of silence and grief, and the grinding procedural endurance of a trial that had asked everything of her daughter and offered nothing in return. She put her face in her hands. And she wept. Not from devastation, not from the particular grief that had lived in her chest since October. From the unfamiliar, almost unrecognizable sensation of a truth that had been buried finally breaking the surface. Messy and costly and irreversible, the way truth always is when it has been suppressed long enough. The city had wanted a monster in chains. What it had found, in the end, was something far more difficult and far more necessary: a mirror. The formal ruling came on a Thursday. Not with the drama the city had perhaps expected. No thunderclap, no gallery eruption, no moment of operatic catharsis calibrated for the cameras waiting on the courthouse steps. The law, when it finally moves in the right direction, tends to move with a quietness that feels almost anticlimactic after the noise that preceded it. A gavel. A statement read into the record. The particular stillness of a room absorbing a conclusion that has been a long time arriving. Judge Pinnock read the ruling herself, which was not required but which felt, to everyone present, exactly right. She had presided over this case from its first hearing. She had watched it transform from what it appeared to be into what it actually was, and she had made the decisions, sometimes under considerable pressure, that allowed that transformation to occur in open court rather than being quietly managed into irrelevance by the people with the most to lose from transparency. It was fitting that her voice was the one that closed it. The murder charge against Pyong Kayubong was dismissed with prejudice. The racketeering charges were remanded for federal review in light of the new evidentiary context, a process that would take months and whose outcome remained genuinely uncertain. Kayubong was not a man without history, and the law's relationship with his history was not resolved by the events of the preceding week. Antonia had been clear-eyed about this from the beginning, had never conflated the question of his innocence in this specific case with the broader question of his life, and she had communicated that distinction to him directly, and he had received it without protest. He had never asked to be absolved of everything. He had asked, in the only way available to him, to be absolved of this. That much was done. He stood when the ruling was read. The court officers on either side of him made no move to stop him. There was nothing procedurally incorrect about standing, and something in their posture suggested that they would not have stopped him anyway, that the moment warranted the latitude. He stood and he listened to Judge Pinnock's voice deliver the words he had waited for across 7 months of custody, and his face did what it had done only once before in this courtroom. It changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way that would photograph well or make a clean image for the evening news. It changed the way a man's face changes when he has been carrying something at maximum capacity for so long that the release of it is almost indistinguishable from pain. He turned once to look at Antonia. She was already looking at him. She gave him a single nod, small, professional, and carrying within it the compressed weight of 4 months of work and sleeplessness, and the particular fury of a woman who refuses to accept that the law is only as good as the people who most benefit from it. He returned the nod. Between them, in that exchange, was everything that needed to be said and nothing that needed to be performed. Then he turned to the gallery. He did not search the rows for supporters or allies or the faces of people who had believed in him. He looked with the directness that had characterized him throughout for one face specifically. He found it in the 4th row. Denise Watkins in a gray coat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes meeting his without flinching. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be respectful, and then he dipped his head toward her. Not quite a bow. Something between acknowledgement and apology, between gratitude and grief. The gesture of a man recognizing that his liberation and her loss were bound together in a way that no ruling could fully address. Denise Watkins looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded back. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was something more complicated and more honest than forgiveness, the acknowledgement of a shared wreckage, the recognition that they had both been used as instruments by people who regarded other people's lives as acceptable costs. It was the beginning of something that had no clean name yet, and that was all right. Some things earn their names slowly. Annie had not been in the courtroom for the ruling. Denise had made this decision quietly and without extensive explanation, and Antonia had supported it without question. Annie had done what she came to do. She had done it at a cost that would take years to fully account for, in ways that an 8-year-old could not yet understand, and that the adults around her were only beginning to appreciate the dimensions of. She did not need to be present for the institutional conclusion of a process whose emotional conclusion she had already provided, in a therapy room in February, when she described a man walking away from her father's body like it was nothing at all. She was at home. She was in the kitchen, at the table where she had spent 4 months drawing the same scenes in crayon, the table that had absorbed the evidence of her grief and her memory, and her extraordinary, stubborn insistence on recording what she knew even when she could not yet say it. The crayon box was there. The drawings were not, because Anthonia had them now, filed as evidence in a federal investigation that would consume the next 2 years of several people's professional lives. The kitchen was quiet in the particular way of a house that has been holding its breath for a long time. Denise came home at noon. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, coat still on, keys in her hand, looking at her daughter sitting at the table with the afternoon light coming through the window and laying itself across the familiar braids, the familiar blue dress, the familiar small hands resting on the table's surface. Annie looked up. She looked at her mother's face and read it the way she had learned to read rooms, quickly, completely, with the full attention of someone for whom the emotional weather of the people around her had become a survival skill. She read what was in her mother's face: the exhaustion, the release, the grief that was not gone and would not be gone but had shifted, finally, from the acute phase into something longer and slower and more survivable. Annie stood up from the table. She crossed the kitchen in 6 steps and put her arms around her mother's waist and pressed her face against her coat. And Denise dropped her keys and her bag and wrapped both arms around her daughter and held on with the specific, desperate tenderness of a mother who has watched her child carry something no child should carry and cannot yet fully believe that the carrying is done. They stood like that for a long time. Then Annie said, into the fabric of her mother's coat, in the voice that had returned to her not all at once but incrementally, the way light returns after a long darkness, quietly, and then a little more, and then a little more, she said the thing she had not said in 4 months. The thing she had not been able to say, not because she had forgotten it or lost it, but because the grief and the fear and the weight of what she knew had sealed it somewhere beneath the reach of ordinary language. "I miss Daddy," she said. 3 words, simple, direct, and containing within them the entire compressed architecture of 4 months of silence. The October night and the table and the shiny buckled shoes and the crayon drawings and the therapy room and the courtroom and the pointing finger and the golden pin. All of it present in 3 words. All of it finally, at the cost of everything it had cost, able to be said. Denise held her tighter. "I know, baby," she said. "I know, me too." The city did not heal quickly. Cities don't. The indictments that followed, Raymond Voss, the deputy commissioner, the 2 council members, the infrastructure authority director, moved through the federal system with the grinding slowness of complex financial prosecutions, and the coverage was dense and technical, and lacking the clean narrative of a child in a blue dress pointing across a courtroom. The Civic Foundation quietly removed Voss's Integrity Award from its website. The district attorney's office commissioned an independent review of cases touched by Voss's involvement, a list that turned out to be long enough to occupy a team of attorneys for the better part of 3 years. Gerald Fitch resigned. He had not been implicated in the conspiracy. The investigation found no evidence that he had known the case against Kayubong was fabricated. But he had built it anyway, had assembled the architecture of a false prosecution from materials that a more skeptical or less ambitious attorney might have questioned. He resigned and did not comment publicly, and moved to a smaller city and took a position at a civil practice. And whether that constituted consequence proportional to what had nearly occurred was a question that people in this city argued about for a long time without resolution. Pyong Kayubong's federal review concluded 14 months later. The outcome was nuanced in the way that outcomes involving complicated men tend to be nuanced. Certain charges dismissed, others reduced, a negotiated resolution that satisfied no one entirely and perhaps, for that reason, was as close to honest as the law could manage. He served no additional time. He left the city afterward and did not return, which seemed, on reflection, like the right ending for a man who had always operated best in the spaces between the official story and the true one. Anthonia Mully was appointed to a newly created position overseeing prosecutorial conduct review in the city's justice system, a role that had not existed before this case and that existed now because of it. She accepted the appointment on a Tuesday morning, sat down at her new desk, and opened the first file. There were others waiting. There were always others waiting. She understood this, and it did not discourage her. It was simply the nature of the work. The endless, necessary, underpaid work of insisting that the machinery serve the people it was built to protect. And Annie Watkins, in a kitchen with afternoon light coming through the window, picked up a crayon. Not the black one, not the gray. She reached into the box and found the yellow, bright, uncomplicated yellow, and she drew a sun in the corner of a blank white page. Then a house. Then two figures standing outside the house, one tall and one small, the small one's hand in the tall one's hand. Simple figures, the way children draw people when they are drawing from feeling rather than from memory. She drew them carefully. She took her time. And when she was done, she looked at the drawing for a moment, at the yellow sun and the small figure and the tall one beside it. And then she wrote a word at the bottom of the page in careful, deliberate letters. Safe. She put the crayon down. She looked at what she had made. And for the first time in a very long time, Annie Watkins smiled. If Annie's voice moved you, if you believe that the truth is worth fighting for no matter the cost, hit subscribe and comment Justice for Annie right now. The heartless will scroll past, but you're still here, and that means something.